Great. Thank you, Bob. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Sustainable Forest Roundtable webinar that we created in collaboration with the Southern Regional Extension Forestry. Our goal is to provide you with the tools and information you need to protect, conserve, and enhance America's trees, forests, and woods. An important part of forest management is monitoring to ensure we get the desired results. And so we've asked Tom DeMeo here to speak about tracking progress through collaborative monitoring. And Tom is a regional ecologist for the Forest Service Pacific Northwest region, where in Oregon and Washington, he administers the Regional Ecology Program, a network of scientists on the ground focused on monitoring, support to planning, technology transfer, ecosystem services, landscape assessment, and mapping data and published products. He's been heavily involved in the monitoring aspects of the collaborative forest landscape restoration project, and he has a bachelor's from Penn State, a master's from Oregon State, and a PhD from West Virginia University, all in forest science. And without further ado, I turn it over to Tom.
Okay, thank you, Lori, and thanks everybody for taking the time today to spend some time on this very important topic that we all work on. As you'll see, today's presentation is very process and conceptual oriented, so it's not a technical presentation on methods. But I found through experience that if we don't get the objectives and the process right, monitoring efforts will often founder. So let's go ahead and get started. So why do we monitor anyway? It's a basis for decision making. Lets us know whether we're on the right course or not, or if we need to stop or change. It provides documentation of what we're doing, and it's sometimes necessary to convince others of a situation or the need for change. So what does monitoring provide? It's really increasing our awareness of what is actually happening. So today's talk is divided into three sections. The first, the principles of monitoring, adaptive management. And then in some detail, I'll go through the process that we use in our collaborative landscape projects in the Pacific Northwest. And we have 5 projects in the region, so it certainly keeps us busy. And then finally, I'll close with some lessons learned and suggestions for your situation. So first, let's start with the principles of monitoring and adaptive management. So monitoring is tracking changes over time, and if you've been around the federal agencies for any amount of time, you'll be familiar with these 3 types of monitoring: implementation, effectiveness, and validation. So implementation is, did we do what we said we would? So for example, we planned on thinning 40 hectares, and we actually accomplished 30, so we completed 75%. So this is the actual tally of what was accomplished. And we certainly do a lot of this. Effectiveness goes a bit deeper, and it starts to ask whether we really were useful in meeting our objectives. So our objective in the previous example was to reduce fuel hazard, and we collected some field data, and we showed that that was the case. So we can conclude that our objective was met and that our effort was successful. And validation is essentially a form of research. It's understanding the mechanisms of the ecosystem. And we certainly do a lot of this too, and notably through our research branch. We want to know, for example, we want to know what the prey basis spotted owls is and how this changes throughout their range. So this would not be routine monitoring on a national forest. It would be more of a research project. One thing we want to emphasize in the monitoring, particularly that we use in the collaborative landscape projects, is that it's adaptive. We want to use our monitoring results to determine our future actions. Are we on the right track? Or do we need to change things? Do we need to stop things? And surprisingly, this doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen very well, and I think it's an area for improvement in all our efforts. So we here's a hypothetical example. We use thinning to reduce fuel hazard, but our monitoring showed that it didn't really reduce the hazard because the debris from the thinning accumulated. So we accomplished the thinning, but this would suggest we need to modify our efforts and remove that fuel physically before we go further and do some prescribed burning. I'm trying to keep these examples very simple so they're straightforward. So we changed it, we moved the material, but we found this was all expensive, so we didn't drop the project. We want to keep thinning, we want to keep removing the fuels, but we learned that we had to be more strategic. We couldn't do it everywhere. We had to be more specific on the landscape, more strategic, so our management adapted. So let's go through this monitoring and adaptive management process. So first is to clearly understand and convey your goals and objectives. Sounds simple, but it very often doesn't happen very well because the different stakeholders, the different interest groups may have different objectives, or they may all think they have the same objective, but they have different understandings of what that means. So it's worth time to spend on this with all your stakeholders and get everybody on the same page. The next, organizing your monitoring as a set of questions is maybe the key message out of this whole presentation, and the most important thing I would like you to take away is that look at your monitoring as a set of questions, but beyond that, make sure that all your stakeholders are involved in this process of developing the questions so that they own it. Too often monitoring is a task that's delegated to scientists, and we as scientists, we do the best we can. We use our experience and our skills to develop some very fine monitoring, but it can be out of sync with what people really want or what they want to know. So in the example here on the screen is, our activities make our landscapes more resilient or sustainable, and this is the key thrust of the collaborative landscape management projects. Not always an easy question to answer, but we have developed some techniques and skills for that. And as I just emphasized, involve your stakeholders in developing the monitoring questions. And this can be a very painstaking and slow process, but it's a really good example that if you don't take the time to do it right, it's going to come back to harm you later, because there'll be confusion about objectives, there'll be incomplete projects, and all those kinds of mishaps. So it's worth it to take the time. For the collaboratives in our region, I would say this project of developing the monitoring questions took months. It took time. But I think if there's representatives of our collaborative on the line, I think maybe at the end, I suppose, they could speak to how well this is working for them. Keep it simple. When we fail in monitoring, it's usually because we don't answer basic questions well and consistently, not because we're not sophisticated enough. There's a real weakness in a lot of monitoring efforts, and you see it all the time, where people gather and they try to think of all the possible questions that they could answer, and they want them answered in a very sophisticated way, but we have nowhere near the resources to do that. And what we have found in our collaboratives in the region, that they all tend to settle on about 8 to 10 questions, and maybe only 2 or 3 of those can be answered comprehensively in what we might think of as a classic research sense. Match the resources available, don't make long lists of questions you will never answer. And we see this happening just over and over again. And this gets to the next question is, okay, if I only have 8 to 10 questions and I can only really answer 2 of them in a classic research sense, then how am I going to handle the other ones? We've kind of coined this phrase, the continuum of evidence, or the quality of evidence, and I have to give some credit here to Paul Hesberg, who helped me develop this thinking at a meeting we had up in Wenatchee. That this concept of the quality of evidence, that it's everything from, an expert panel, professional opinion, through photo monitoring, quantitative computer methods and landscape assistive, to actually quantitative on-the-ground data. And in reality, we are finding that for a lot of our monitoring work, we have to rely on these less rigorous methods because of the limits of the resources available. And that may be fully adequate to meet the objectives of the collaborative. It may not be adequate for a published peer-reviewed journal article, but it may be adequate to meet the monitoring needs of the situation. And also another thing we found in the Pacific Northwest is, we use the phrase triage, is that using, less intensive, more general, less rigorous methods broadly across your landscapes, and then reserving data-intensive methods for areas of high interest or controversy. For example, with the Lakeview Collaborative, they decided that white-headed woodpecker and its habitat merited a full research approach. So we are collaborating with Vicki Saab from the Rocky Mountain Station and her colleagues, and as well as Kim Mellon McLean and the wildlife ecology effort in the region, to do a very intensive on-the-ground monitoring effort. But we felt that was justified because white-headed woodpecker is a very important indicator species for a lot of key elements of our east side habitat. We would not be able to afford that investment in all of our monitoring questions. Also have to consider scale. Some questions are best answered at the landscape and more at the local scale, such as riparian issues in livestock are very often a local stream issue. Involve leadership in developing the monitoring plan. This is another common failure that we often see, is that, again, monitoring is delegated to the scientists. Leadership is not particularly engaged in it and wants to see the outcome. This is another way to help keep that list small and manageable, because leadership is always very keenly aware of the actual resources that are available, and they can step in and say, look, folks, you're getting too ambitious and you need to tone this down on what we're trying to do. I have found that the leadership engagement in the collaborative landscape projects is fairly good. In some cases it could be better. But I think they are getting the message that we do want them involved. Only after the questions are precisely decided on do you decide on the methods, although going through the process of vetting the questions helps point you towards certain methods. But then this step 10 is sort of the logistical part of it. If you look at the companion paper to this talk, the Tracking Progress paper that was distributed, it goes into some detail about how you screen the questions. And then there's also a pretty comprehensive table of how the Lakeview Collaborative ended up with their questions. And so I think that provides a very good real-world example of what I've been talking about this afternoon. Okay, so I'm just going to expand a little bit more on what we did in the collaborative landscape projects. Why did we approach it this way? Well, when the collaborative landscape projects emerged about 5 years ago, myself and some of my colleagues, we really wanted to get engaged and try to learn from past mistakes. And some of those I've mentioned already, but getting isolated from leadership and stakeholders, long list of monitoring questions to please everybody, and working at inappropriate scales. Those are some of the mistakes. Again, if you don't involve your stakeholders, you have a risk of uncoordinated efforts leading to patchy results and missed key questions. Very often, in classic natural resource work, monitoring is kind of seen as an afterthought, and we really want people to engage in it and make it a priority. And by, at least trying to get all the stakeholders to commit to this and say, yes, we are going to do this monitoring. When you really commit to doing something, it helps to make that list of questions shorter. when you really have no obligations to follow through, it's easy to make long lists that nobody's going to implement in the end. And you know, an old saying in the profession that I've heard from a lot of different people, it's okay to make mistakes, but to make new ones. And I think if you apply the principles that I've talked about here today, it will help you to avoid the same old mistakes. In the collaborative landscape projects, again, we really tried to be innovative, tried to emphasize adaptive management, that we will learn from our mistakes, we will adjust. Emphasize the collaboratives owning this process and getting the process right. And all five the collaboratives have embraced this process. The way they're implementing it differs a bit. You know, there's different flavors, there's different emphases on who's doing the work. But I think in general, they're all following this process in some form. This is a flow chart that my colleague Bernard Bornemann at P&W developed. And it looks a little daunting at first, but basically it's saying front and center, develop the questions and prioritize with involvement from the stakeholders and decision makers, and screen those questions with evaluation and ranking criteria. And some of those criteria might be, you know, what's the cost needed? Has this work been done before? You know, very often we don't ask that question. There's lots of people doing stuff out there all the time, and the question may have already been answered, or at least substantially. Is it going to facilitate adaptive management and a decision-making process? Is it going to provide the decision maker with some clear options on what they should do? Is it at the right scale? Is it focused on outcomes? In your set of monitoring questions, are you adequately representing social and economic questions as well as ecological? I think in the Forest Service, traditionally, we're pretty good on the resource side and not so good on the social economic. And we've tried to engage expertise from academia, research, and other sources to help us with that in the region. After it's fitted to you know, a learning method, a monitoring method, then you can see how it goes through the different screens to get to the outcome of an annual or multi-year report, and then how it feeds back into shaping decisions. So these are, I just wanted to mention, we had national direction on the collaborative landscape project in these four areas of fire regime, fish and wildlife habitat, watershed condition, invasive species, and we went through that exercise last fall, and I think we can say we had a pretty successful outcome, not in the same sense of quantitative results so much as in helping to point out, you know, where we were deficient and what we needed to emphasize in the future. So again, just to recap, identifying the questions, screen and refine the questions, develop a plan that all your stakeholders own and buy off on, then finally actually do the monitoring work in step 4, synthesize those results, and then use those to help project design in future conditions. Another thing we've tried to stress is frequent reporting. You know, an annual report that's maybe not as complete as you would like is probably far more useful than a perfect report 5 years from now. Because by then the project will have run most of its course, people would have moved on to other things. We live in a natural resource management environment that's rapidly changing all the time. And so time matters. Reporting on things promptly is important. So again, recap, emphasis on collaborative owning the question and criteria formation, use those criteria to refine the questions. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very time-consuming to do this initial phase, but at the end, you have questions that are fully vetted, practical, very well refined. You should be at a point where you're confident that you could actually do them, and your entire collaborative is committed to that. Here are some of the criteria that I've already reviewed about cost and time, will facilitate decision, quality of evidence. And here are some of the actual refined questions about what's the effect of our treatments on moving the landscape towards a more sustainable condition. What are the effects on our focal species? And again, you can't analyze every species, so you have to focus on a set that's going to have the biggest implications. And white-headed woodpecker is one that we've used in ours. Another big issue in our region on the east side is the concept of spatial heterogeneity at the local scale, the skips and gaps and retaining elm trees. And we've engaged Derek Churchill and some other folks in helping us with that. Noxious weeds, invasive species is an issue we all struggle with. It's a very difficult one. But all of the collaborators have at least one question related to that. And well, as I mentioned earlier, we're pretty good on the ecological side, not so good on socioeconomic. Some of the collaboratives are doing a good job on this and moving forward, and others are still coming to grips with it. But we all know it's important and that we need to do it. So at this point, all the collaboratives have plans and are refining and implementing them. And as I mentioned, we recently did the national exercise. And then finally, just a wrap up here with a few lessons learned. Getting to that small list of precise questions is very difficult, but it's worth it. We found that it can be very time-consuming to get there, and it's not so much that there's controversy about it, but it just takes time to get people organized and hold meetings and work around schedule conflicts, and oh, by the way, throw a project fire in once in a while, and it slows things down. So it takes time, but it's worth getting there. It's a good way, by doing a collaborative, to reduce tensions within the collaboratives and conflict, because if you're all working on something that actually has to happen in the ground, it helps people to see realities and learn to work together. One thing they constantly struggle with is, the amount of rigor. As I mentioned, it's usually only a few questions that can get research grade attention, and the others have to be less rigorous. That makes people nervous about defensibility, but we're working our way through it. Time matters, particularly in reporting. And do the best with what you have. And there can be a real lot of angst over, are we doing the best we can? We don't have the resources we need. But it's really a good exercise of triage to do the best with what you have available. And I think over time people are finding that they're building their confidence and they're doing a better job, more efficient job in monitoring. And of course, training and communication is essential. It also takes time to get everybody on the same page, as I mentioned earlier. In the science community, we think we know what monitoring is. We've worked with it for all of our careers, and we are pretty comfortable with it. Not everybody, not all the stakeholders are in that boat. Not everybody has the same understanding of what monitoring means because they have different objectives. It's a lot about building capacity and understanding and looking at the big picture as well as the small one. Monitoring can be sometimes integrated with inventory. I think we're trying to do that with some of the white-headed woodpecker work. You can also use it to inventory vegetation types, although this particular point hasn't been a real big issue in the collaborative. Design your monitoring so it will really be used. And with that, Bob, I don't know if we're taking questions at this point, or...
So at this point, anybody that has questions for Tom, please enter them into the chat window.
Okay.
So while people do that, let me remind you that the publication that Tom talked about is available. You can get to it from the portal. And what I'll do is also get you, push out the link again for you to here in the chat window. All right. While people take a moment to do that. Okay, here's a couple questions. Do you see them? The first one is from Guy. He's wondering, how does this project-level monitoring relate to large spatial scales, landscape, regional, etc.?
Okay, at the broader scales, we have a fairly robust effort in the region from multiple directions on landscape assessment of the range of variation or departure from that, and insects and disease and other things. These kind of things are best tackled at the sub-regional or regional scale. We also stay in close contact with national efforts like land fire and the terrestrial condition assessment, the water check condition framework. So we are thinking a lot about how these different scales relate to each other. And if you have the publication handy, on pages 8 and 9, there's that table of how Lakeview arranged their work.
Okay, our next question is from Dr. McGallis. He's wanting, are you seeing other U.S. Forest Service folks using your monitoring advice for the forest climate scorecard efforts?
That's a good question. I don't know if this approach has been used with the scorecard, but we do, at least in our region, we do try to stay pretty well integrated with everything that's going on. I've certainly spent a lot of time working on scorecard, and we have our network of ecologists in the forest that are working on this as well. I think that scorecard process is kind of evolving through a triage process where we're trying to emphasize what's the most important out of those 10 indicators. So I wouldn't say
next
that
up is from
we're directly
Gene,
influencing
and
that.
they're wondering how much capacity does the Forest Service staff have to do monitoring above and beyond their existing duties?
Another really good question, but that was one of the things that influenced us when we developed this. Was we realized we didn't have a lot of extra capacity. We realized there wasn't going to be a windfall of money, although the collaboratives do apportion part of their funding for monitoring. Some of the collaboratives as much as 10% of the budget. Others it's much less than that. So there isn't this huge windfall of money. There's some capacity there, but we've tried to build it into and around what we're already doing. I don't think it's realistic to ask for a huge expansion of Forest Service monitoring, but I think we can
the next question
be smarter
is
and more effective with the
and they're wondering, in the CFLRP, how many times does the multi-party monitoring happen in a year? Also, is the report that is produced after monitoring, is it considered a joint reporting, meaning stakeholders in U.S. Forest Service are committed to all key monitoring findings?
Good question. We're probably not doing as well with our reporting as we should be. I think some of the collaboratives are reporting out to their members, and as I mentioned, we recently had that national roll-up effort. We didn't design the monitoring to be a pulse where all the stakeholders physically go to the field together and collect monitoring data. It was more like a monitoring program where they were involved in shaping the questions. In some collaboratives, I think they are talking about groups of stakeholders going out and doing the monitoring, the citizen science concept. And notably at the Lakeview Collaborative, for many years they've had a group of high school students that's been organized by an educator to go out and do the monitoring. And when the Collaborative Landscape Project came along, we embraced their work and then modified it to fit this process better. So, to answer the question, it's kind of all of the above. It's happening in a lot of different fronts, but we don't have a rigid.
So the question from Alan is, how much should monitoring be driven by scientific interest versus real-world visual cues, public understanding concerns, and how do you address these in creating your monitoring questions and protocol?
That's also goes to the heart of the matter here, that we've tried to integrate these things because you're having all the stakeholders involved in shaping the questions. It helps maybe nudge it towards that more real world, because from a scientific perspective, monitoring isn't it's tracking the actual quantitative changes in the environment, but from an interest group perspective, it might be more, is this meeting my needs? Is this meeting the needs of my organization? Because, people form collaboratives to advance their interests, and this is a way for them, and I think in a very healthy way, to track whether those interests are being met. So it's kind of a mix of the two. If you look at that list of questions that Lakeview developed, I think they would all pass the science credibility
So from Graham
test as well.
Cox, he's wondering, can you give us some more examples of social monitoring measures?
Not my expertise. I've been involved with some of it. But they tend to focus around jobs and income coming into the community. That's a very important part of the whole collaborative project. I think this one, Raising Congress, set it up was to help rejuvenate rural communities, and so people are very interested in how many jobs is this creating? What's the economic effect on the local community? And I know another key question some of my social science colleagues have been involved in is how much of that economic generation is local, and how much of it's going to outside.
From Mike Oliver,
companies.
Wondering if collection of baseline data is critical for monitoring effort. This can be done as part of resource inventory, which is required by some agencies before a project is funded. It just needs to be categorized as such on the front end. And he was giving that to us just as a comment. So thank you, Mike.
Right. And that, yes, thank you. That's something I certainly respect. And I often look at inventory monitoring and ecological.
And then Scott Jones is wondering, where can we find the documentation of what the collaboratives are doing, and is it online somewhere?
Yes, I believe that Sustainable Northwest has it on their website. If not, I can follow up on that and ensure it's available.
So
I know
Tom,
we have the monitoring plan.
Yeah, and if you want to send me that link to where it's at, we can put it on the portal page for the webinar, and then people can find it there.
Sure.
So, a comment from Sarah.
Okay.
The Lakeview CFLRP monitoring report has been able to answer some questions, but data is still being gathered for others. The high school students collect data every year, but haven't visited many post-treatment plots. So, Sarah, thanks for sharing that. Jim, go ahead, Tom. Do you have any comment on that?
Right. No, I was just going to say, Sarah's one of our folks who's helping them with their data management, and I think she's exactly right. And that kind of just points that this is a work in progress. We don't mean to imply that we've been monitoring and the collaboratives for many years,
so,
and we've got this all figured out. We really just started.
This one is for me. So Jim, yes, we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available on the portal, sustainableforestrywebinars.net, and will be under the on-demand webinars for today's webinar. And then for question from Richard Edwards, wondering how much data in general are you able to get from the U.S. Forest Service Common Stand Exam platform?
I think, that's another data source that's available to us, and if it's appropriate to answer the monitoring question. That gets back to the screening criterion that I mentioned about, has this work been done before? Are there existing data sets? We certainly emphasize in this process that people should use existing work and existing
Okay,
data sets.
And for those who are looking for the link to the Sustainable Northwest, that link has been published in your chat window, so you'll be able to click on it there to go to that web page. Or, as I said, we'll be adding it to the portal page. If you want to get back to it later, you'll have access to it. And there's also the link to the Forest Service CFLRP.
Right, and I'll do some follow-up to verify that those monitoring plans are online. I'm not sure. I know I
So at this time, do we have any further questions for our presenter today? If so, please put them into the chat window. And while we wait to see if any more comes in, I'd just like to take this time to thank you, Tom, for putting this all together for us. It's been a very interesting topic. Truly enjoyed it.
And thanks, everybody, for taking the time to participate today. I appreciate it.